Well, without further ado, because we do have to finish at 4:15, or this panel at 4, because I know people have got flights to catch. As much as you don't want to leave this lovely place, you need to get home. So, first, Susie, you're first again.
I don't think I go last this time. It's that really fun.
Oh, I'm open to suggestions. Fabiana, are you happy to go first?
My point was the last one regarding
Reverse
policies.
order.
Sorry?
No, let's go.
We're going to go. I don't know.
Stop.
Yeah.
You can go stand up there if you want. Or you can sit down. It's entirely up to you. I just can't stand up too short.
Sounds very... No, that's too good.
Sit here. You can sit down.
So what I've been asked to do is draw on themes about theme 1, about respecting participants and communities. And obviously, this is a theme, or all the themes have been very interactive throughout the 2 days. So I'm sorry, this is just a small glimpse at some of the critical points. So what did come through, that this is complex and it's a challenging area. It's not straightforward on multiple levels, conceptually or practically. And often respect for participants is conflated down to traditional research ethics guidelines regarding consent and privacy. And they don't fit terribly well with biobanking or data sharing. And there are questions really about how much moral weight we can attribute to seeking consent or attempting to assure the privacy of samples and data. And so what we discovered were there are a wide range of approaches being taken to seeking consent, and that often there was limited understanding amongst participants contributing samples and data. And there were real questions about the value of consent in this context and the implications for governance. We also discovered that privacy was both challenging in practice to assure in all cases, but also it wasn't necessarily a priority for many of our participants. This wasn't the thing that they're most interested in. And instead, we needed to look more broadly at benefits and their interests. And one important area was the return of results. People are interested in what kind of findings you might get from their data and samples. But there's also a big issue about benefit sharing and when it might be possible, what kind of benefits might arise from these uses, and what kind of benefits should go back to participants. And there were some concerns that the conversations about benefit sharing are moving on, and some of the major research funders and organisations haven't kept up with more recent discussions about how we should start sharing the benefits of data and sample sharing. And there was also one case where we thought in public health emergencies, there might be a tension between participants' interests in getting research done very quickly and filtering into health services and getting rapid treatment, and the interests of the researchers who may want more of a capacity building element. So some tensions there between the benefits that could accrue to different people when we're thinking about benefit sharing. So we snuck in a little bit of equity, I'm sorry. I know. And so we then had discussions, so not just how much work can consent do, but how much work can ethics review do? And there were a number of examples of groups where big decisions were being dumped on ethics committees without necessarily frameworks and guidance for making those decisions. And then no, we won't go into that. That can come up later. And then finally, the second point was how much work can community engagement do? And this came up a number of ways. How much moral work should it do, but also how much community engagement should we undertake? And we saw a range of approaches from some collaborations where it was thought researching community engagement wasn't necessary and it wasn't possible. And so there were real pushbacks about if we need to engage with communities, and non-receptive funders and researchers thinking it wasn't necessary. And then there were other collaborations where it was critical instrumentally both to recruit participants and retain them in longitudinal studies. But we're then thinking what also is the intrinsic importance, this idea that we respect people by engaging with them. And so questions arose and discussions took place about how much we need to engage people in decision-making, whether or not they should inform policy and guidance or case-by-case decision-making. And the point we came down to The point that we came down to was that we wanted this in our orange group, this is where I'm misrepresenting our group, is that our key point was this needed to be two-way communication, and we didn't want this to be a highway in one direction and a bicycle track in the other direction. We weren't here to educate participants. We noted that, for example, with biobanks, a lot of people had very strong beliefs about blood, and we weren't here to explain how they were being superstitious and silly. We were here to consider what the importance of those were, how they might be importance, and how that should drive how we design the biobank. For example, in some settings, people would be wanting samples back after a family member died so that it could be buried with the body. If that is important in that context, how do we design a biobank that can take account of these views? We're not here to explain that science is better and rational and that trumps concerns about sensitivities about blood and samples. We're here to speak and to listen to our participants. And that there are a number of ways that you can engage with local beliefs, and that if you don't engage with beliefs, then this idea of the scientific progress or the benefit that you produce from the data sharing or the research may not feel relevant or important to the community. It's something that's important to you, but not something to those who've provided the samples or the data. They may be more important in other priorities that they'd like you to address. So we were looking, for example, about discussions about how we might develop good participatory practice around data sharing and sample sharing. Finally, we snuck in a little bit more equity, and this is a theme that's come up throughout the sessions, and thinking about the fact that researchers are also a community in this place, and they're a vulnerable community, and that they have particular needs. And without going through all the discussions, one of the main points that we noted were even where funders are building capacity to share and curate data, this may not be effective in national settings. If you are a researcher without the time to conduct research or secondary research, it doesn't matter if you had a nice week and you've now got capacity to analyse secondary data. You can't do it in practice. You may not have the time. We noted that some researchers conduct research on their own time. They pay for reagents out of their own resources because they are in constrained situations where there isn't money for research. And in that case, they may feel that the data really is theirs. They put everything into this. They didn't receive any funding. So how might we enable or engage with them about sharing materials in that case? And so we had some discussions about what are the responsibilities of international actors to build capacity and support data sharing, but what needs to be in place in the national environment to make sure that the measures implemented can actually be useful. So, for example, so we can avoid the situations where funders say you can cost data sharing in, but researchers feel unable to do this because it will raise the cost of their research application and make it uncompetitive. So how can we work with all these measures to make these approaches to promoting fair share actually work in practice, and that it wasn't straightforward?
Fantastic. I think Naresh is
Okay.
Steve,
Thanks, Catherine.
What we'll do is take questions or comments at the end, so I'll hold them for them.
Okay, so thanks, Catherine. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm reporting on behalf of the Pink Group. I know they are listed in your notes, but I just want to calm my nerves, so I'll just mention the names of my group members. So the chair was Atula Sumatipala from Sri Lanka and the UK. He's our rock star. So, Wangani Yangulu from Malawi, Paula Sana from South Africa, Rachel Knowles from the UK, Maria Corazon de Hungria. She's probably taking a selfie somewhere. Helen Nansumba from Uganda, Sunil Venekar from India, Noor Hayati Itman from Malaysia, and myself. So we had a good gender balance. We had 5 females and 4 males. We had also a spread of age groups, I think. Atula and myself were the youngsters in the group, right? So we had fun. So I, so I hope I represent my group well. Um, so the theme that we looked at was advancing good governance national, and we agreed that governance is not only about ethics. Governance also covers legislation. It was felt that multidisciplinary slash interagency bodies should regulate biobanking, and there should also be an ethics framework. There were concerns expressed about private biobanks, in particular those run by pharma. There was a potential for exploitation. However, effective regulation by national governments can lessen the scope of exploitation. Further concerns were expressed about the aims of private companies when setting up biobanks. They may not have the same aims as public funded biobanks. Particular concern was about governance in relation to profit-making goals of commercial companies. We agreed that the private sector is more likely to manipulate the biobank and focus on specific markets with a profit objective. On the plus side, private organizations can respond and act faster, and this can benefit research and development. The key issue is not to stop commercial involvement, but to have better oversight. For example, all research involving human subjects must have ethics review by an accredited committee. For example, FAIRCAP, which is the acronym for the Forum for Ethical Review Committees in Asian and Western Pacific region, to prevent commercial manipulation. It was also felt a recognized standard of governance for private biobanks is important. Farmers should be able to establish biobanks, but there must be a system to control and regulate these. However, ethics committees are not often able to review biobanks or provide the level of regulation required, despite being expected to fulfill this role. There's a need for a specialized ethics committee to review and accredit biobanks. We should also be careful about conflicts of interest between those establishing biobanks and those using the samples, especially where this is the same individual or group. At the University of Cape Town, the data management policy provides guidance and principles for data access and management, which state that the ethics committee should play a key role. However, this policy was not checked with the ethics committee before being implemented. So now ethics committee are complaining that they don't have the specialized knowledge needed to provide this access control. Therefore, University of Cape Town is now setting up a specific data access committee with specialized knowledge focused on biobank and data management. So that probably rings true for many of you. India does not allow export or sharing of biosamples. This means that all research should involve a local biobank in sample analysis. Local researchers should be involved in the study design to build capacity and avoid poor science, incorrect interpretation due to inexperience. In South Africa, there's a policy to encourage historically disadvantaged universities, institutions to become involved in research, but mainstream universities often complain that the data / analysis can be of poor quality due to lack of experience and expertise. Quality of data can be a problem, but also material transfer agreements and secondary data transfer legislation makes it difficult to involve disadvantaged universities' populations in South Africa. The group noted that it's interesting that consent was given to the Taiwan Biobank for specific analysis, but then the data was also used for secondary uses. In Malawi, we can only take consent, and this is example in Malawi, for specific use. Consent to secondary use or broad consent are not permitted. However, it is often difficult to enforce this. The question that arose is, are we clear what are we trying to prevent by emphasizing specific consent rather than broad consent? For example, for remnant residual samples. In the UK, US, they are often trying to maintain privacy by restricting secondary uses, but the discussion today focused more on using specific consent to prevent exploitation. Perhaps specific consent is not the best or only way to prevent exploitation. Are there other ways of governance that mean we don't lose value or of remnant residual samples, but don't have to rely on a specific consent? And that's a question that we have. There was an instance where research team asked the Indian government to make a decision about secondary use for public benefit where specific consent was not given. Secondary use can often be acceptable within a wider interpretation of consent. That is, if the consent is to use for HIV outcomes research, then this could be interpreted as use in any HIV study, but not for a malaria study. The risks and benefits should be assessed by the ethics committee. Sometimes if the consent is not there and it cannot be interpreted broadly, then researchers need to apply for waiver of consent. So in my own experience, in my research in the 1990s, I don't recall getting ethics approval for getting samples from the mortuary at Dagobah Hospital, nor from vascular surgery. If it was required, I wasn't aware of it. So all I know was that I had age and gender information, but no names. So it's impossible now to go back and get consent from individuals whose tissue it is. So this is an example of when to use a waiver of consent. There's still a public social benefit test needed to support an application for a waiver of consent. So I'm almost done. Anonymization and the use of consent waiver depends on the research objective. A waiver can appear to be a lack of consultation and is not always acceptable. In Uganda, waiver has been a problem as individuals were concerned about it being used to allow profit-making and exploitation. We also observe that there is no law to punish a PR who is unethical. People, and I have this in inverted commas, shop around for a lenient ethics committee. So I want to end with a question, and that is, who should have the final say? The ethics committees or the legal regulatory system? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Real pleasure to be here. My name is Ross Upshur. I'm from the University of Toronto, and I'm on the Planning and Steering Committee. I would like to thank the organizers, particularly the Secretariat, and we thank them and we will thank them again for all of their hard work in bringing us together, and our funders for allowing us to be in this great place. And similar to my previous colleague, I'm going to thank our chair and our reporter in our group, and I'm going to name them by name because their names deserve to be heard in public. Now I have to take my glasses off so I can read. So Jantina de Vries was our chair, and Joe Millam was our note taker. We had Anna Palmero, really an all-star cast. Jay Tavode, Elizabeth Matthews, Kieso Hutun, hope I said that correctly, Arisa Moaka, who's over there, Tawonge Matande, Haney Slim, Dorcas Wachira, and Dimfo Ralafala. So we had the whole world at our table. So I'm here to report on the red team, and I will take some editorial license, because I've been waiting all day. No, sorry. So everybody's worked very hard today. So I just want, and we've had our lunch, and we've got the steel of the blood. It's all going to our, gastric and gut circulation. So we're feeling a little tired. And I just want to give you a moment to just close your eyes. Please join me in this. Close your eyes for just a few minutes. We're just going to do a little guided imagery. So close your eyes. And while you're closing your eyes, I want you to take 5 deep breaths in and out. And while you're taking your deep breaths in, I want you to imagine the ideal governance structure, okay? 1, 2, 3. In through the nose, out through the mouth. 4. Okay, everybody open their eyes. So I have this magic device from technology that's taken the ideal governance structure, and it's here in my hand. And I'm going to open my hand and show it to you. Okay, are you ready? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It's disappeared. Somebody stole it. Is there witchcraft in the room? Susie, did you take it from me? Oh, wait, no. Maybe it's in the App Store at Apple. So interestingly, I do this with unicorns and people. So everybody knows what a unicorn is, and then you start to ask people, yes, it's a beast with a horn, and it looks like a horse, but it's not a horse. And they say, well, is your unicorn pink or is it purple? Does it have stars? I have 2 daughters. When they were little, they liked unicorns. And they had a variety of unicorns, and no 2 were alike. And so even though we all have an idea of what good governance is, there's very divergent rules about how much it should lean towards subsidiarity, how much it should lean to universality. And so there's work to be done, and our group actually has some concrete suggestions on moving this agenda forward. So I do want to express 2 fears before I go to our recommendations. One is we've heard a lot about governance and good governance and why we don't hear about excellent or best governance, or is it good governance or governance of goods? The language counts. And so how we think about that is important. And whether we think we have best practices, should we articulate and share them? But a lot rests on governance, and a lot of work, and a lot of people now, trust has become like, another big concept. So just in my own ethics research empirically, for 20 years, I've done study after study in clinics, in public health emergencies, with genetic information, and trust keeps coming up. And I'm still not sure, and I've got a longer presentation on what trust is or isn't, but I do want to point out that there is some very interesting normative work done. But Annette Beyer, who wrote this beautiful paper called Trust and Antitrust, and at the end of about 35 pages of very close philosophical argumentation, comes to the conclusion that the trustor-trustee relationship is very complex and really hard to figure out. And here we are talking at broad levels about ineffable future uses and broad consent, and we're hinging it on trust. So we need to really do some interesting thinking about trust. I do want to use one of her quotations. She says, and this is interesting because we're here in the Cape, and the Western Cape is its own unique floral kingdom. It's the smallest, but it counts as a floral kingdom. And if you ever get the chance to go to Postberg, which is over on the west coast in August or September, when all of a sudden, if the sun comes out, you look and it's a carpet of blooms. Everywhere you go, yellow, green, beautiful flowers. It's very delicate because And trust is like Pottsberg, because trust is a fragile plant which may not endure inspection of its roots, even when they were well, before inspection, quite healthy. So trust is something we need to think about. Now to our group. Our group we thought trust was important and that we needed to actually start to think about having international, so we're doing the trust on the international scene. We had 3 questions to talk about. One of them was, one of the high-level things is that we do need to start thinking about having some sort of international consensus meeting about what good governance, what are the key elements, what are the non-negotiable elements of a governance mechanism that we can all agree upon and then tailor and craft to our own specific uses. And I saw some hints of that in some of the posters that we were looking at. So governance has become clearly an issue. One of the questions that we were faced with was the whole issue of cultural sensitivities and whether those should trump and be managed or do they in any way supersede potential scientific gains. We thought this was a bit of a false dichotomy. We thought that cultural sensitivities are managed not best by trading them off against the optimization of science, but actually engaging with them simultaneously to actually better understand what those cultural beliefs are and why they're important. And I'll just put a little normative language around it. We didn't at our group. There's a growing discourse around what's called epistemic or hermeneutic injustice about who has a voice that gets heard. And if we don't listen to people's beliefs, if we simply dismiss them as being cultural sensitivities, then we're guilty of committing epistemic or hermeneutic injustice to the participants that we're largely pledged to protect. So we need to actually think of really important and imaginative ways of engaging simultaneously and turning what seems to be a barrier into a strength. Secondly, the big issue around sustainability and capacity building versus the exportation of samples. And we had a long discussion contrasting similar cases in nations where they had been successfully able to delay research while they built capacity locally to do the kind of work that was done. Sri Lanka and Brazil were the examples used. as opposed to other countries, and Malawi and Zambia were used, where there was a restriction, and I think India too, there's restrictions on exports of tissues. Now, what we think is that in those cases, there should be some plan for capacity building. It's an obligation to at least to the government or to the nation, to take steps to build capacity to ensure that there is the capacity to do that analysis. And we were very strongly of the belief that if exportation of tissue was continued, that there needed to be a strong justification for it, and relying heavily upon the sort of natural necessity because the lack of capacity was an argument whose time and utility had probably passed. We wanted to also express the support for concrete policies that should promote local capacity. So shift, and that can be done, that could be actually enshrined at the international level. So to shift resource enterprise to the source communities where the samples and data come from. And H3 Africa was used as a great example where there's concrete rules and practices, leadership, who's going to be the PIs, where the data resides, and who gets to analyze it. We also thought it was really important to put the feet to the fire and have time limits and actually set milestones for capacity building goals. And that there should be lots of ways that we can devolve power and expertise to local communities. A fourth point that came out of this, and it's kind of a meta-level concept of thinking about governance, is that we're often making decisions without empirical evidence, either through the form of comparative policy analysis, and so we're acting often on what I would call strong prior beliefs or strong prioritization. This has to work. Why? Because this is the way we do it. Why do we do it? Because that's the way we do it. Rather than stepping back and say, what are those best practices? Which kinds of regimens work? Can we actually start to think about creating an evidence base, innovate, and evaluate? So global governance, like research ethics, are not static doctrines that are written for all time. We can actually, and it takes a while to get people who are trained in research ethics to think that you can actually do research in research ethics, because you're often worried about, here's the guidance documents that we have to enforce, and after you've been, I've been on a lot of ethics committees, you think, that's really a silly rule. Why is that rule there? Can we actually get rid of it without anybody noticing? And you take it out and nothing happens. The sun still comes up the next day. But we need to actually think about innovation and research and evaluation of governance models. And this leads to our final point about creating supportive communities of practice. So this was something that took a long time in the bioethics community. You used to have the lone bioethicist doing consultations in the hospital with nobody to talk to, and they were actually bearing quite a lot of moral residue. And so we started to build networks in Toronto, and that we call them communities of practices, hub and spoke models. But we need a similar thing for people in ethics committees internationally who are struggling. It was striking the similarity of issues between very diverse jurisdictions. And everybody's suffering on their own, and there's no reason for people to be bearing all of that weight of similar structural issues. There's got to be a way of creating communities of practice and supporting them, either with continuing professional development opportunities through online resources, with ideas of sharing lessons learned and sharing solutions, and, dare we actually suggest that people involved in research ethics do comparative collaborative research on governance structures to see what works best in which circumstances and why. And I hope I have done justice and not epistemic injustice to the absolutely marvelous Red Group, and I really enjoyed spending time with them. So thank you for your time and attention.
So my name is Naomi Waithera. I work for the Mahidol Oxford Research Unit in Bangkok, and I will be feeding back on behalf of the Yellow team and also drawing on insights from the discussions over the last 1.5 days around promoting equity. So as now is the norm, I will start by acknowledging my group. So the Yellow Sunny team was led by the very interesting chair, Michael Parker, and other members in the group are Catherine Dickler. So yeah, she agrees it's the best group. We had Sharon. No, I think we have this settled. Yellow was the best. We had Sharon, Thea, and Mary, Liliana, Yogesh, Maurice, and David. So very interesting discussions, and indeed one of the things that has really been thought-provoking and eye-opening is to rethink the concept of iniquity in research. So when you do hear the term iniquity, what you think of is this predatory action where a high-income country comes and does some injustice on a low and middle-income setting. That's what we're preconditioned to think. But it's actually quite different. Iniquity takes a lot of forms, and one of the key issues which arose from this meeting was there is iniquity even within research groups. There is iniquity even within projects where the data collectors or the sample collectors are not appropriately acknowledged and do not get the direct benefits from the work that they have done. So that's one thing that needs to be addressed. And the other is that in generation of the research questions, there is a very top-down approach where the people on the ground are not the ones who are proposing the questions and generating the research that's appropriate for the context. The other sort of iniquity is inability to use data or samples that have been shared, because there is no awareness that these resources do exist. We had the example put up by Karen this morning, talking about there is a rich repository of data that one has had for years, but the data use of that repository is very limited. But is it a question of the people who could use this data are not aware that that resource actually exists, and that is why it's not being used? And also, if they do have access to this data, do they have the analytical capacity to actually run the analysis on the data? The other question that comes up is quality. So you do know there is a resource, you do access the resource, but you find that either you cannot use that data because the quality is really bad, or the effort that it takes to answer a simple research question is so immense. So we should address these issues, but who is who? Who is this person who should drive promotion of equity in research? So we had a lot of discussion around that, and we actually came up with more questions than we did answers. One of the suggestions we had is perhaps the research ethic committees should take the role and have the mandate of ensuring that equity is promoted. However, we do push a lot of responsibility on these ethic committees. Do they have the capacity within them? Do they understand what data sharing is, what sample and tissue sharing is, what the implications are? Then perhaps we should start with building that capacity and creating that awareness so that when they are making the decisions, they are making the decisions from an informed point of view. And we've seen examples where there are data access committees which have been set up and which govern the process. For example, the H3 Africa or the WARN model, that works very well. However, it is institutional or it is based on a certain project. That means that that DAC will address certain issues for a certain context. And there might be a time limit of how long that DAC exists as well. So we need a body that has a wider jurisdiction and isn't just addressing issues for a particular repository. And not to say that the DACs are not important, they play a critical role, but there are other researchers who might not have either the resources or the ability to have access to a DAC who would be the protective layer on them. So we thought, perhaps then the government has a role to play in this, but the government is not the expert. And if the government is to make rules and to make laws, sometimes these laws tend to be more restrictive than they are promotive of research and actually the equity that we're looking for. So as a research community, as bioethicists, we have that ability to push the government, making sure that we go back to them with data-driven proposals and ideas and push them towards making some sort of legislation that will actually promote equity. Then lastly, we thought perhaps the funders are better placed in enforcing this, but how do they do? The funders will tell us what to do. The funders will give the funding for the project, but they will not tell you what to do. And also, do the funders have the ability to monitor and continuously look at the quality, to monitor the secondary data use? but perhaps they should more encourage research output and make sure that the research that is generated is not just driven by the impact factor on what kind of journals the research gets published to. And we've seen that some of the funders, for example, the Wellcome Trust, creating a platform where researchers are able to publish without any, addressing the impact factor issue. And because of that, you get researchers from low and middle income areas are able to publish even without the hand-holding of a researcher from a high and middle income area. And I think this is the biggest barrier that equity promotes, that presents when we start to talk about equity and putting out the research output. So coming out of this, what do we do next? The first thing we need is to create awareness around what resources exist in terms of repositories, in terms of biodata repositories and data repositories, how they can be accessed, how they can be used. But even more, we need to enable researchers to access these and be able to do their analyses and be able to use that data. So initiatives that promote capacity building should be funded on a longer term basis and not just for a particular period to make this a continuous effort. And the other thing is we found there is a very important role that data management plays in generating data that is going to be of good use after the research is finished. So we need to train researchers, make sure that they do understand data management, that they do understand how to use the data, and there are courses that do exist and have been developed by groups such as the H3 Africa. And lastly, we need to build the capacity of ECs, train the ECs so that when they do make these decisions, they make them from an informed perspective. So that's about it from the Yellow Group and about promoting equity.
Thank you very much. My name is Fabiana Arzuaga. I am from Argentina, and I will report the results of the interchanges and inspiring conversations that we have at the Blue Group regarding policy and guidance. The members of the group, the chair was Professor Doug Westerner from South Africa, Hugh Whittle from the Nuffield Council of Bioethics from the UK was the take noters. I had to work as a rapporteur, and the members of the group were Águeda Muñoz del Carpio Toya from Peru, Toru Masui from Japan, Mrs. Garahari from India, Nick Tiffin from South Africa, Florence Mudvesi from Zimbabwe, Felix Chuknowi from Nigeria, Roger Sira from Burundi, Sylvia Nabukenya from Uganda, and Harbun Zhang from China. I'm sorry for my bad pronunciation of some of your names. Well, we have very, very interesting conversations, and most of the presenters that were participating in the policy and regulations group were represented in our discussions table. So, and I have the pleasure also to be accompanied by many of my colleagues from Argentina, Florencia Luna, Liliana Siede, and Ana Palmero. We, all of us have participated in the process of creating a governance framework in my country for biobanks. We started in 2011 and are still working very passionate in order to provide our country with a modern and internationally harmonized system for the biobanks, which has not been an easy issue, but we are struggling to achieve the goals. So, well, we could observe in all the presentations that our countries, developing countries, are having some common issues regarding the governance for the biobank systems and the managing of the data and the samples and how to protect privacy and to comply with the ethical requirements. And the conclusions of our groups are, some specific connotations from our countries, that all of our countries have at least some minimum frameworks for clinical research, which is in most of the presentation has been related that all of us have something to start and to use as a framework. Not all of our countries have specific regulations for biobanks, and we have several differences and aspects to achieve regarding what is the meaning of a biobank, which is the difference with a biobank and a repository, which is the role of the ethical committees, which are the rules regarding how to share data and samples, how to protect privacy in genomic information. None of us have norms regarding how MTA must be, and many technical aspects of the biobanks that can each country, according to the social values and with the history, must achieve. Taking profit of these kinds of meetings in which, as Doug explained at the beginning, it is not an event in which experts are teaching to people that is less maybe trained, but it is maybe a space where we can share experiences and learn from each other, and mainly to have some new ideas to influence in our countries, in our spaces of influence, to improve our systems for research and finally to have access to the benefits of the science. So the conclusion of our group is that the governance systems for the biobanks and the policy and guidance is not only or must not only have to be concentrated in regulatory norms with some punishment effects. It must be complemented by some specific norms or laws, and complemented by a soft system integrated by training of the ethical committees, contacts with the research community, political decisions or influencing the politics or the regulators in order to give a framework for that this issue, which is the scientific knowledge and the sharing of the scientific knowledge and the better taking of the results of the science can be received by the populations or by the citizens. So as a final comment, I would like to invite you, as our chair of the table invited us, to think about what can be take away from this meeting, what can be take with us to improve our systems, our regulations and governing systems in our countries, and to collaborate as much as we can in any international opportunity that we have to improve the biobank and data sharing of our communities and countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabiana. Thank you, all panel members. I realise a serious injustice has been done in this room. Susie's team members haven't been named, but there are 3 groups who were not named at all. Right, so here's where the injustice is going to be readdressed. You can ask a question or make a comment on anything that's been said on the panel, or anything that's pressing that's come out of these discussions over the last 2 days that you'd want to take home with you. I think something that's really struck me while I'm waiting for someone from one of those 3 groups to put your hand up is the sense of responsibility. Where does it lie in this process? We've talked about that, and I think Naresh finished with that question. We're putting a lot of responsibility on different players. Are they the right people? What is our responsibility as a consequence of this discussion? What are we going to take home? What's the government's role? What's the funders' role in this process? And then I think also what's come across is the redefining of some of the terms that we've been thinking in. So out of this morning's discussion, I think a lot of assumptions that people had on what inequity is, or we thought it was in data sharing, isn't actually what it is on the ground. So I think redefining some of the terms we're using, good governance, what actually does good governance mean in terms of data sharing and biobanking, and how does that differ to other types of research? What about benefit sharing? That's been bandied around a lot. What does benefit sharing actually mean? Who's responsible for defining it? Are there global benefits? How do they fit with cultural country level benefits? I think we've spoken about collaboration or working together more. And it's not the narrow definition of research collaboration that I think we all walked into this room with. It's a wider definition. And that means collaboration amongst recs, bioethicists, funders, other peoples to find the right types of policies for this environment and this space. Trust, another favourite word of the bioethics community. Trust or trustworthiness, might get in trouble for not calling it that, and trusted systems. I think we have a responsibility to start really unpicking these terms that we are banding about and using and really starting to understand them. Capacity. Used to be a dirty word. I think we heard in one of the talks that you weren't allowed to put it in an application, that a funder would run a mile from it. I think we're moving to a world where we think that capacity is critical, and it is critical for research development. And I think we all have responsibility for making sure that everyone aware that this capacity isn't a dirty word, it's a necessary part of the research process. And then the other thing that I thought really struck me, that was a really interesting analogy with the stock exchange, but actually what came out of that for me, that human capital question. What have you got in your country that you could be utilising to actually start addressing some of these capacity issues? And who do we need to make aware of this? We have an awareness issue as a community, whether it be a research community or the ethics community. How do we get our messages across better? So there's some food for thought, and where's that hand? Perfect. Right, have we got a mic or have I got them all?
Ahmed Samid, NCI Egypt. Talking about trust, actually one point we mentioned during the discussion that there is sometimes lack of trust between ethics committees and scientists or researchers. And I think it should be collaboration, actually. Both sides work together in order to improve research. So what can we do to build this trust first between the two teams that should work together, instead of feeling scientists or researchers feel that they hate ethics committees, they don't like what they are doing, they are putting very high restrictions to research?
Great question. Any of the panelists got the magic answer, or is it here, Ross?
That's there, yeah. It's in my hand. After, we'll go for another guided imagery. So the other side, or the negation of trust, is not needing trust. You can do actually a lot of useful, good work without trust, where you actually have explicit policies, expectations, and obligations that people are expected to live up to. So that's why I'm always curious about why and in what circumstances things are put under the umbrella of requiring trust. And I think we got to be very wary about how much goes under there, because you can do a lot of work. The antithesis of trust isn't necessarily distrust, but you can have actually reliance in reliable systems that actually work, which don't require you to trust or distrust. That would be my answer.
Other questions, comments? I'm going to stick to time. We've got 5 minutes. I'm going to take 2 and then give the panel. We only got 1 mic. I'm going to take 1.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I've learned so much over the last 2 days, so thanks to everyone involved. what struck me was the similarities between the problems across LMIC around the world. So I felt a little less alone, which was a good thing. I also felt that these issues of inequity and trust and equitable sharing, all of that could not be solved but within this paradigm that we are looking at it. I feel that two things are really necessary. One is this capacity issue that Catherine just mentioned, and it needs to be solved it can be solved only with large-scale capacity building in LMIC. Whether that can be achieved in a day, definitely not. It's a long-term process, but it has to start somewhere. Secondly, there's an economic case for capacity building, as I've been discussing with some of you. The volume of research that can be achieved by involving the human capacity in LMIC would be so much greater, and there is definitely an economic case for it. The second thing I wanted to say was that we are looking at autonomy as a principle, consistently looking at informed consent to make things equitable or fair or justified. But in the context of where I heard that some communities are 98% illiterate, looking for informed consent for research and looking at it as a way to salve our conscience that we have done right by these communities is, in my opinion, somewhat fooling ourselves is what I'm thinking. And I urge people to look at beneficence as a competing and equally important principle, just as much as autonomy and informed consent. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone want to comment while the mic? Last question. I'm going to give you the last question. Any comments from the panel?
Yes, I'd just like to fully agree with you. Capacity building is something that's going to take a long time. And I think we have started the process with initiatives like H3 Africa and WARN. The trouble is these projects tend to be time limited. So what happens after their funding period is over? So what I think we should be pushing is to get more funding for longer term capacity building initiatives.
I think that the data sharing and biobanking has really turned the model of the way that we do research on its head, and the way that we need to think about how we fund it in the future, because it's also unethical to build resources that hold samples or data that are only for a finite period of time on one low if they're not maximize the utilization of them. That's also unethical. So I think something needs to be thought about that. Final question.
Okay, I'm Sofia Salas from Chile and from the Green Group, one of the excluded groups.
Perfect. Justice is done.
Yeah. I would like to raise a point that we discussed briefly in our group and relates to research that is funded by Big Pharma and confidentiality clauses that they request PI to sign, and that usually local IRB are unaware of those sort of agreement. So I would like to ask, in terms of data and sample sharing, what can we deal when it's Big Pharma funding the research?
Yeah. One of the points we have discussed in the Blue Group, it was about intellectual property of genetic resources or human samples. And a problematic that is common in our countries. We are, as developing countries, we are also high diversity countries. And our politics, for example, protecting the intellectual property, if you go to and try to patent a gene or a natural resource in any of our countries, the patent office will say no, because it is just to protect our biodiversity, different from the central countries, maybe the European countries, USA or Japan, which allow to patent natural resources, just considering there is inventive step only for discovering a natural resource. So we were discussing this issue, and we think that countries should be at least we need to have some registry for the genetic resources, human genetic resources in our countries. There is a very difficult point in big pharma. Normally patents all their medicaments or discoveries or new developments. So, and patent offices do not ask to the applicant of a patent which is the origin of the genetic resource. And with the revolution of genomics, we need to have some measures to protect our natural resources. It's gene information or genomics from our populations are natural resources of a country. So at least in that arena, it should be important that the governments of any of our countries can have some registry or some control on that research, or when the clinical trials are developed by maybe the medicaments office, just to know which was the origin of a natural resource or a genetic mutation or combination that can be used in a new medicament.
Thank you. Thanks, Fabiana. Can you join me in thanking all our panel members? They've made it look easy, and it's very hard to summarize.